Welcome, Tim.
Thanks very much.
So could you please self-introduce a little bit?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'm Tim Romero. I've been in Japan about 30 years. I've started 4 companies in Japan in that time, sold 2, bankrupted 2, so 50-50, not too bad. I'm currently the head of Google for Startups Japan. Before that, I worked at TEPCO Ventures in CVC. I run a podcast called Disrupting Japan, where we introduce Japanese founders to the rest of the world. I've done some angel investing. I've taught entrepreneurship at New York University's Tokyo campus. I've just been very involved with the startup ecosystem here for the last 25 years.
Great. So you have a very strong background. So especially in Japan, or you're interested in other regions?
I've been connected with ecosystems all over the world, both in Europe and in San Francisco and Boston, but all my real hands-on experience has been here in Japan.
Okay, super. Yeah, as a Japanese, I really appreciate it. Yeah, so how do you see the difference between the Japanese startups and the, rest of the world startups?
Well, I think that some of the most, I think first of all, they're much more alike than they are different. A startup in Japan is much more like a startup in San Francisco than either one is like a big company in America or in Japan. But I think some of the more unique aspects of Japanese startups are the importance of relationships with large enterprises, both in terms of corporate venture capital, because a much larger percentage of venture capital is from corporations in Japan than it is either in Europe or North America, but also in the go-to-market. So I think because of the importance of brand loyalty in Japan, you see a lot more startups partnering with enterprises to go to market than you see, especially in the US, where it's a much more almost combative adversarial relationship. Where in Japan, there's a broader opportunity for cooperation with enterprises.
So, network-wise, maybe Japan has a stronger network compared to or tight network,
Yeah, I think it is. It's much tighter, and that's both good and bad. It's just different.
Yeah, just different. Okay, thank you so much. Such a kind of the unique aspects came from the Japanese culture or Japanese human's personality, or?
Well, a little of both. I'm careful not to call anything a direct result of culture, because that's a very fuzzy term. I tend to think in terms of risks and rewards. So the Japanese market is the way it is, and the best way forward is often partnering. So I don't know if that's so much a cultural thing as more of just a market reality.
Thank you.
But I do think, but when you mention, I do think part of it is cultural. So for example, a lot of Americans, when they're looking at the Japanese market, will say that, Japanese are risk averse. They don't like to try new things, and that's not true at all. So for example, if Suntory decided they were going to introduce 10 new flavors of canned coffee, that might be hugely popular. People would want to try them and compare them and try new things. But if some new startup says, oh, we have this new canned coffee, Japanese consumers are going to be careful and say, well, who are these people and why should we trust them? So I think Japanese consumers particularly are just as novelty seeking, just as interested in trying new things as consumers anywhere in the world. But the brand loyalty is an extremely important part of that.
Great, yeah, great. Hearing such a difference or the aspects, I'm Japanese, but I even didn't realize such aspects. So yeah, great to hear that. Thank you. So yeah, I'd like to move to the next question. You have seen many Japanese startups. So how you see the entrepreneurship in Japan and how it changed over time?
Well, the transformation over the last 20 years has been amazing. I think a lot of people in the ecosystem want to compare Tokyo to San Francisco, and that's not really fair. But I think if you compare Tokyo today to Tokyo 20 years ago, it's much easier to see the progress. It is much easier for startups to raise venture capital. When I started my first startup, people started startups when they had no other option. Mm-hmm. And now a lot of students from Japan's top universities are starting startups. A lot of people are leaving companies mid-career to start startups. It's become socially acceptable. It's become less risky. And I think perhaps even more important, the government on every level has been extremely supportive of it. I think it really started with the Abe administration, but the Kishida administration has continued and even accelerated their support for startups. But we see it on every level. So in addition to the national level, the Tokyo government's been very supportive. They launched the biggest startup event that's been done in Japan for at least the last 3 or 4 years a few months ago. And even Shibuya, the Shibuya government's being very active in their startup support. So government support at every level.
Okay, national level and the city level and even, world level.
Yeah, and I think just yesterday, the national government announced that they were easing the visa requirements for people who want to come to Japan and start startups.
Okay, so super. So maybe the Japanese going to have the non-Japanese founded startups in Japan.
Well, I think actually, even if you look at Silicon Valley, the non-American founders play an incredibly important role in innovation. And I think that's true everywhere in the world.
Yes, it's a good mix.
Yes, it is.
So you explained there's a lot of opportunity for the Japanese startups. They can start the startups very easily compared to the 20 years ago. And my question is, where the opportunities are for the Japanese startups that want to succeed globally?
Well, I think the opportunities are everywhere. The world is much, much smaller than it used to be. So there are very, very few truly domestic markets anymore. So I think almost every startup needs to be thinking about going global from the very beginning. Now, going global doesn't necessarily mean the US, at least not at first. A lot of Japanese startups, their first step out of Japan is into Southeast Asia or Korea. Particularly hardware startups are very focused in that area. So I think that there's this recognition among startup founders that the global market is much more important than it was during the dot-com era, for example. So I think the opportunities are everywhere. The funding has really increased recently as well. So doing a global expansion requires a lot of capital. So usually startups would sort of wait until after they IPO'd, could raise enough money and then go global. But now both Japanese VCs and foreign VCs coming into the market are providing that growth capital so they can go global. And we're seeing more and more startups going global now.
Thank you so much. So we will see the many Japanese startups going to out of the world.
Hopefully more and more.
More and more. So I'm looking forward to see that. Thank you so much for today, Tim.
That's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.